Hi, I'm Leah, and I'm a Dickinson College student and House Divided intern, and today I'm going to do a close reading of Lincoln's letter to Orville H. Browning. On September 22, 1861, Lincoln wrote a letter to his friend, confidant, and political rival Orville H. Browning. Browning and Lincoln had a lot in common. Both were born in Kentucky but then moved to Illinois. Both were lawyers, and both started out as Whigs but then became Republicans. The letter was a response to Browning's letter of the 17th, just 5 days before, about General John C. Frémont. Frémont was in charge of the armies of the West, and he was an abolitionist, so he was emancipating slaves as he moved his army along. Lincoln had ordered him to stop, and Browning wrote to Lincoln, questioning his judgment in doing so, claiming that he was disheartening the abolitionist Republicans and he might lose their support. Lincoln answered Browning with these words: General Frémont's proclamation as to confiscation of property and the liberation of slaves is purely political and not within the range of military law or necessity. Now, there are two important things that I'd like to pull out about this passage. The first is that Lincoln clearly differentiates between confiscated property and freed slaves. So, Browning is not an ardent abolitionist. He's actually very conservative. So this was just quick evidence that Lincoln clearly held these beliefs to be true, that slaves were human and not property. Next is the word necessity. Lincoln uses this more than 3 times in the next passage alone. If a commanding general finds a necessity to seize the farm of a private owner, for a pasture, an encampment, or a fortification, he has the right to do so, and to so hold it, as long as the necessity lasts, and this is within military law, because within military necessity. Necessity is a word that Lincoln uses a lot to defend his position on emancipation. He wrote to Albert Hodges in 1864 that he did not tolerate Frémont's emancipation order because it was not yet an indispensable necessity. But if emancipation were not a necessity, and if Lincoln believed that a president did not have the right to, quote, expressly or impliedly seize and exercise the permanent legislative functions of the government, as he said in the letter to Browning, then why would he issue an Emancipation Proclamation, the first draft of which he read to his cabinet just 10 months later? Some historians, and Lincoln himself, would claim that it wasn't yet a necessity, but that it would become one as the North kept losing to the South. Slaves provided men, and they provided arms and goods to the Confederate armies, and so to emancipate them would be cutting off a valuable source to the Confederates. The content of that letter seems to validate this so far. But one historian, Burris Carnahan, believes that Lincoln always planned to emancipate the slaves. He just needed an argument that would hold up in the face of protest. Carnahan claims that Lincoln's lawyeristic response to Browning was meant to provoke their rivalry and incite him into presenting to Lincoln his best argument in favor of emancipation, so that Lincoln could use it in drafting his own proclamation. Browning did, in fact, compose a 15-page response to Lincoln in which he did exactly that. One thing that upholds this argument within the context of this letter is that Lincoln dwells on the position of loyal slave states like Kentucky. Having Kentucky remain in the Union, of course, meant more men in arms for the North and less for the South, but it also validated Lincoln's hope that the Union could stay together with slavery only restricted to slave states. It was a key state for Lincoln, who claimed, quote, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. If Lincoln were provoking Browning into drafting an argument for proclamation, Lincoln and Browning would need to convince loyal slave states like Kentucky of emancipation's necessity. Lincoln ends the letter by insisting that he had no intention to fire General John C. Frémont, but this of course did happen on November 2nd, just over a month later, because Frémont refused to retract his order. Now, this letter to Browning is full of contradictions, and we can look at it in either of these 3 ways. 1, Lincoln was a lying hypocrite who didn't care if he were a dictator as long as it didn't look like he was one. 2, that he was forced to emancipate the slaves because it would become an indispensable necessity to win the war. Or 3, that he always intended to emancipate the slaves. He just needed a good argument.